I am Coach Sess, motivated and determined, and you are listening to Words with a Mad Coach. Welcome, Mad World. Come into the atmosphere. Have confidence, passion, focus, unrelenting motivation and determination. Don't think about stopping, defeats, setbacks, obstacles, or your haters. See the end in mind and reverse engineer your success. Master the process, become energized by your progress. This is the way of the Mad World. So what's on your mind? How was your weekend? Hit me up in the timeline, in the comment section. Let me know what you did. The old coach got busy with movies. Yeah, didn't go out, but looked at some digital formats, revisited some movies I've already seen, like the Justice League. I wanted to go back to it. Did you notice in that movie that Wonder Woman had heat with Superman, Batman, and Aquaman? Now, I was never a Wonder Woman fan growing up in terms of the comic books or the TV show or any other movies they may have made from that entire series. So I was curious as to, was that heat intentional, or was it just a movie thing, that they just tried to build some tension? Because you don't have a lot of female interaction, male interaction throughout the movie. You have Lois and Clark, and no other real love interest. So I was like, am I seeing this? Am I reading too much into this? So I went to, of course, the Marvel Universe and looked it up. So apparently, somewhere in 100 years, Wonder Woman has had some involvement with Batman, Superman, and Aquaman. So it made sense now that watching this movie that they would create this heat, this general tension that was between them. And you see it the way Wonder Woman is somewhat defensive of Superman. When Batman wants to bring Superman back to life, she's a bit emotional regarding that situation from my perspective, from just a warrior perspective of, having the big guns on your side. Let's get the job done. She's a bit more defensive and emotional about it. So I think that was the director's way of bringing that out, maybe for, later movies or whatever. And then you also picked up on the Batman tension when Alfred was making reference to Bruce Wayne about calling her, saying, should I send her a note? Will you be on my team? Check yes or no, which is an old reference to love letters that boys would send to girls way back in the day. And then, of course, you got the tension from Aquaman when she put the lasso around him, and he looks at her and says, "You're just so beautiful." And so you see it, you get it, and I liked it. It was worth watching. I know a lot of people didn't like the movie in itself, but I think you have to start looking at these new movies and new stories written away from what you're used to, away from what you think you know. The same thing can be said about Star Wars. I think you have to step outside of yourself and leave your old brain at home and pay attention to what's going on in the moment. What's going on in the moment right now is fight contracts. There's a lot of discussion on social media boards in the MMA community about fight contracts, and the two words that I want you to pay attention to is ancillary rights and perpetuity. You have to be careful. Sometimes the managers that you're dealing with, the agents, they'll rewrite phrases in these contracts that imply, that you surrender your basically digital rights, and that means that anything that's dealing with your image, your name, your nicknames, your stage names, your personas, things that deal with DVDs, books, going into movies, anything that you may embark upon later on, that they actually have some entitlement to, even if they don't do any work, if they don't get you the contract, if they don't get you the deal, if they don't help you write one line or write one song, they still have the right to use that material, and maybe even to some degree, depending on how it's written, receive royalties. And so fighters need to become more educated about giving away their ancillary rights, ancillary rights, I think is how it's spoken in English, in American English. But be careful with that. Don't give away your rights unless it has something to do with your fighting. If you're signing a fight contract, then you should sit down with your agent, your manager, and say, okay, what specific things lead up to being successful in terms of my fight career? We're not talking about being successful in the cage or in the ring fighting, but the things that elevate your status in the fight world. If there are some digital projects that you have to do to get that elevation, fine, but those things should be outlined. And the other word that you want to pay attention to is perpetuity. In other words, that they don't have access to anything and everything that you do forever and ever and ever. All right? You want to look for these types of words, not necessarily these words specifically, but just the general feel, the general implication of these words. They're going to be written throughout the contract, and you have to learn to read them and look for these sentences structured together that imply perpetuity or the surrendering of your ancillary rights. You want to be careful with that. You want to make sure that whatever contract structure you use, that you are only involved in projects that promote the specific interests. In other words, if you're talking about your fight career, if you have to do clothing, then any clothing contract you get with Louis Vuitton doesn't have anything to do with anything you may do for tap out. These things are separate. So if it's the fight stuff, your contract should be relevant to the fight apparel should be relevant to your fighting career. If you have outside avenues, whether you create them or they're available to you, and it's outside of the terms of the contract, then they shouldn't. That agent or manager shouldn't have access to that beyond the contract. Now, inside of the contract, I would definitely say that whoever your agent is, you should use them for all things. And if you guys can come to new deals and new structures, rewrite the contract as you cross those bridges. But don't just sign a one catch-all type contract that makes you a slave. Right? That doesn't make sense. You're in this business to learn, to grow, and to negotiate. So why would you just sign your rights over to somebody else? Coach D just did a video on Fight Camp about contracts, and he had one phrase in there that I really like. Is that, if you can come up with a good deal that's best for you and the promotion, then fine, go with it. And I think the secret to that is understanding what a good deal is for you. All right, moving on. That's enough on that. But if you have some comments, suggestions, or even questions, just hit me up. Okay, so the last thing that I want to touch upon is another subject that came across social media boards was the idea or concept of matchups, or what a fair matchup is. So in order to do that, I wanted to take a look at a matchup from Fight Lab 58, which is the fight between Brandon Schofield and Bryan Battle. Schofield is 7-3, and Bryan Battle is 3-1. On the surface, it could look like that's an unfair mixed match, but I'm going to break it down and help show you, or try to convince you, that it's really a fair matchup. A lot of times with overmatched fights, or sometimes undermatched fights, it's some things you need to consider. For instance, you want to consider the frequency. How often are these people taking fights where they're fighting competition too good for them, or how often are they fighting tomato cans? Short notice, how often are they doing that? Or do you only see this when this happens with short notice fights? Are we seeing guys take on competition below their standard on a regular basis, 6, 7, 8 weeks out continually? Then you might have an issue in terms of matchmaking. Duration of the fights. Are these 3-minute rounds, or 5-minute rounds? What is the compensation? Sometimes, guys who are pro fighters, sometimes they get paid a little bit more to take a short notice fight. Sometimes they get paid a little bit more to take a killer. So these are things we need to ask questions about. Now, on the flip side of this, if you are a fighter, you want to be careful with matchups in terms of guys who have a poor track record of, let's say, they're always tapping out in the first round. This kind of thing you want to be careful with. It just shows a pattern that this guy might not be taking his career too seriously. Also be careful with suspensions, because guys get suspended because they don't make weight too many times, or they don't show up to weigh-ins, or they're always injured. So let's say you're training 6-7 weeks out and the guy doesn't show up because he's got this track record of, being suspended, being injured, or being, sometimes you see this when guys fight in a new weight class. I get scared for my guys if they want my guy to fight at 135 and the guy that they have for us has always fought at 170. He's never fought at 135, never fought at 145. He's always fought at 70. I tend to be a bit leery. I doubt that the guy's going to get to that weight class. Okay, so these are some things you need to consider when looking at matchups. How old is the guy? What does it benefit you? Is your coach confident in the fight that you'll be challenged and that you're not overmatched, that you're probably going to win? How many rounds is it? How many rounds has this guy had in his life? And in what ways did he finish his opponent, or in what ways was he finished? So when it comes to matchups, it's a lot there, but I'm going to use some of that information to break down Schofield versus Battle. So Schofield 7-3 overall. 6 of 7 fights were finishes, and 1 DQ win, and 3 losses by finish. And so Battle is basically the same way. He wins, he finishes everybody. He loses, he gets finished. All right, so we know that Fight Lab 58, this fight right here, these two guys are going to fight to finish. They're not looking to strategize. I won't say that. They're definitely working a strategy, but they're working that strategy to finish, to put their opponent in the weakest position as soon and as often as possible. Schofield, I thought this was a little bit strange until I looked at it in totality. Is his first 6 opponents were debuts. I was like, good God, this guy's sandbagging. But then I looked at the weight classes, and he's bounced around in weight classes, and the bigger boys do have a hard time finding opponents. Especially again, if we go back to some of the considerations I brought up earlier about short notice, they do have this problem. So it's not too far-fetched that he would have opponents who were debuts. He did jump around. 7 of his 10 have been debuts altogether. Looking at Battle, he's got one loss by way of KO, and his opponent's total fights combined are 5, whereas Schofield's opponent's total fights combined is about 14. And Bryan has about 1 year of MMA, and Schofield has about 6.5 years. Now here's where some of the numbers start breaking down. Schofield's had about 13 rounds in 6.5 years, whereas Bryan has had about 5 rounds in 1 year. So when I start to hit the ratios and look at it, I say, okay, it starts working itself out. Also, Bryan's been active in the last year, taking 4 fights, and he's 3-1 in the last year, whereas Schofield is 1-0 in the last year. The other thing you see about Schofield, he tends to bounce around from different gyms in terms of his affiliation, whereas Battle seems to be very consistent with Highest Stand and Electric City MMA, Blake Price's gym. So, this is, to me, is an even match overall. And it's just some things that the guys have to do strategically to win it or lose it for themselves. My overall feeling is that the fans are going to be the biggest winners when it comes to this fight right here. All right, of the 12 fights they have listed so far, I'm betting that this one steals the show. This is the show stealer. There's always one fight on the card that could be a show stealer, and right now this is my leading contender for that. I believe that Schofield has to take Battle down and remain on top, and he's got to keep it there all 3 rounds to be successful. All right, at least that has to be his mindset. I know that both guys are going to go in the finish, but the mindset has to be take him into that deep water, take him to where neither guy's really been, which is the finish of the fight. I think Battle has to keep it standing and have that mindset to go all 3 rounds and earn his 4th win. Now, I'm a huge fan of activity, so I'm going to say that Battle has the edge in that department in the last year. I'm also a huge fan of experience, so I'm going to give that to Schofield. But when I look at recent activity, what have you done for me lately? Janet Jackson coming to mind. Battle's 3-1, Schofield's 1-0. Battle's got solid camps, solid training partners, and it just shows that he's taking his career a little bit more serious. Schofield has shown some inconsistency, taking off a year. These gaps, he's got gaps of 6 months, he's got gaps of 11 months, gaps of a year. So when you see that, you wonder if the guy still has the heart to keep doing this day in and day out. But as my old coach would say, Ken Armstrong would say, you have to fight these damn fights. All right? That's true. But for right now, my data is leaning toward Battle. I'm Coach Sess, and you've had Words with the Mad Coach.